13. We don't have time to go into this as deeply as I would actually really like to, and I'm going to have to ask you to come into a way of thinking that many people just haven't looked at the New Testament, particularly when it comes to the destruction of Jerusalem. And what I mean to say about that is we're living 2,000 years nearly after Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. And it's easy for us to not really see why that's a big deal. You might not have even known that Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans, but it was a huge deal to Jesus. And it was a huge deal to the apostles. And it was a huge deal to the Christians that were living during this time period. It is difficult to overstate how momentous of an occasion this was for the brethren that were alive in this time period. And because we don't understand that part, when we read something like we're reading in Matthew 24, which includes a number of prophecies and also apocalyptic language, we can very easily take this text and not understand what in the world is being discussed because we say, well, nothing like that has happened. I remember at one point, my grandmother gave me my first real adult Bible. I don't know exactly how old I was, but I was definitely under 12, so I was maybe around 10. And she gave me this NIV, bonded leather cover Bible, and from that point before that, I want to say that I was just using kid Bibles, or maybe I had like a little New Testament type of thing I would flip through. But when she gave me that Bible, I remember I started digging in, and I wouldn't really know what I was reading, but I would jump around, and I was really excited to have my first adult Bible. And in the course of looking at the Bible, like kids do, I'm going to end up in the book of Revelation a lot. And I remember reading the book of Revelation and all of that apocalyptic language, now that I understand what that is. And at the time, I was like, man, it's going to be crazy. There's going to be monsters coming out of the sea and stuff. I'm like reading these things, and in my mind, I'm literally thinking like, wow, this has happened. So I remember I went to my grandmother, and I sat down with her, and I said, Granny, this is nuts. What's coming with monsters in the ocean and everything else, like this is really scary stuff. And I remember my granny saying, well, there's a lot of people that believe that's already taken place. And I said, well, they're obviously crazy, because I haven't heard anything about monsters coming out of the ocean. And to me, it was like clearly whoever would say this has happened doesn't read, because this is like a horror movie. Now I'm one of those people. So we understand language differently as we start to understand the Bible more and start to understand how language was used differently by different cultures at different time periods. And we can over-literalize things when we're dealing with societies that are very accustomed to using apocalyptic language to describe big events. And what I have found is that while this is common knowledge, even in the denominational world around us, that apocalyptic language is a thing, and it was used a lot in the Bible, I find that there is this inconsistency that people often have where they want to take things literally when it serves their needs, and they want to take it figuratively when it serves their needs. And so you end up with the inability to actually interpret anything when you're following that methodology, because you don't know what's supposed to be taken literal and what's supposed to be taken figuratively. You just do whatever feels good to you in the conversation. If you've ever read something like the Left Behind series, you see this constantly, because you'll have this constant conversation in these books about, oh, this is figurative and this is what was meant. And then it's literal when you've got these other things happening. It's like, well, why is this literal and this is figurative? When we talk about Matthew 24, we're touching on all of that. We're looking at all of this conversation that I'm having right here in front of you about apocalyptic language, about Left Behind series books, about when things are going to happen, about what it's going to look like. We're dealing with conversations around premillennialism. We're dealing with conversations around the end of time. We're dealing with conversations then around the destruction of Jerusalem. What in the world are we looking at when we look to a chapter like Matthew 24? And in this really brief time, I am going to attempt to give you an explanation of that. So, I require some patience and probably some follow-up conversations with you one-on-one if you continue to have questions afterwards. So let's dive in quickly. We are going to have this as our starting off text. Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone." And I'm going to start off by kicking an anthill, because I'm going to also get at something that we say a lot. We often quote the last part of this right here, and we say he's talking about the end of time. And I want to kick an anthill with you right now and say that that is not what Jesus is talking about. When Jesus says, "Of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone," he is not talking about the end of time. He is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And we are going to, I am going to seek to prove to you that that is the case this morning. Now, you can take whatever implications you want from that, but I want to keep it in our context. I want to keep this conversation right here, and if there's some strings to pull on otherwise, then we can do that if we have any spare time. Probably not, but certainly in one-on-one conversations. But right here, we're talking about this text, and I want to talk about what it's dealing with. All right, so if you did this warm-up beforehand, if you had this lesson and you were looking at it, you'll note that you had the most warm-up of any warm-up that I had asked you to do. And I asked you to read Matthew 24. I asked you to read Luke chapter 17. I asked you to read Luke chapter 21. I asked you to read Mark 13. And that is a ton of reading. If you didn't do it, I don't blame you. But the reason I included all of those is because what you see in Matthew 4 is a compilation of several conversations of Jesus, not one. Matthew does this. If you look to the book of Matthew, it is organized topically. Matthew was taking different doctrinal components of Jesus' teaching, and he was grouping them together to make it easy, because that's Matthew's modus operandi, so to speak. He was there to try to make the teachings of Jesus accessible and grouped together. Each one of the gospel writers took a different philosophy and approach when they were compiling and putting together their stories. When you then take Mark's accounts and Luke's accounts of some of these same words, it's actually really helpful because it shows us that Jesus was having different pieces of this conversation at different times, which in a roundabout way actually helps to really prove the case that I'm going to lay before you this morning of what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24. So when you're dealing with Matthew 24, you're looking at really statements that Jesus made around the same topic, even though they were made at different times. So how Matthew then compiles this together is super helpful, because if Matthew doesn't change topics, Matthew is telling you Jesus didn't change topics in all of these words. That's good for us. It means that we can keep our mind on one thing when we're reading. Also, I want to note to you, and this is very important, that what's going on in Matthew 24 is not disconnected. It's not a different topic from what was being discussed in Matthew 23. Essentially, what Jesus is doing in Matthew 23 is laying out 7 woes. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I think this will help to communicate this. Jesus lays out 7 woes. Does anybody remember who Jesus is speaking about and toward in Matthew 23 when he gives his woes? Woe to them. That's right. He's talking to the Jewish leadership, these teachers of the law that were supposed to be shepherds of the people, and he lays out 7 woes. And he ends Matthew chapter 23 with a couple of really powerful statements. Someone read verses 36 and 37 of Matthew 23 for us, please.
"Truly I tell you, all this will come on this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing."
All right. Now, I wanted to read 36 because, of course, that's very much akin to our statement we're opening with from Matthew 24. So I want you to note that Jesus uses the same timeline in Matthew 23. This generation, all these things are coming upon you, as he uses in Matthew 24. This generation, all these things are coming upon you. And he is talking to these leaders of the Jews, and he gets a little more broad now at this point, and he looks at all of Jerusalem. And he says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I wanted to gather you together." So many times. Jesus is eternal. Jesus is God. He is eternal. Jesus, as God, has attempted to gather together Jerusalem again and again and again. He sent the prophets, and what did they do to the prophets? They killed them. They killed them. Eventually, even the son was sent. And what are they going to do with the son? They're going to kill him. The apostles are going to go, and they are the last. They are the last-ditch effort. And Jesus tells them in Matthew 24, we're going to read here in just a little bit, they're going to kill you. Jesus is looking at this city, and he's saying, I didn't want this for you. What's coming, what he's about to discuss, I didn't want this for you. I wanted to bring you together. You wouldn't have it. So he says in 38, behold, your house is being left to you desolate. He says, now on, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's how chapter 23 ends. And in chapter 24 and verse 1, Jesus came out of the temple. He was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. This is a big deal. What did the temple represent to the Jewish people? The presence of God, God's abiding presence with them. The temple was, just its very existence, was very symbolic to the Jews. It was the representation of his presence on earth, of his presence with them as a people, of God's Spirit. Remember when Solomon built the temple, how it was so full of the Spirit, it was like a fog you couldn't see. It was so thick. This was the presence of God. The temple is very important in the center of the heart of the people. It also is where lineages were stored. It's where the priests carried out the primary leadership of the Jewish people. This is hugely important. And they're looking at it, and the Jews had pride in this. Even Jesus' closest disciples have pride in this fact. And they're showing him the buildings of the temple. It's like they're showing it off. It's not theirs. They don't own it, but they're proud of it. And Jesus says, don't you get it? Not a single stone will be on another. This is going to be razed to the ground. It's gone. That message is a shocking message. It's actually one of the reasons Jesus is killed later on, because it was blasphemy against the temple. Since they're very figurative people, if you speak badly against the temple, it is the same in their mind as speaking badly against God. So when Jesus is saying these things, you have to understand that there are many people in his day, including the leaders of the people, that would view what he's saying as blasphemous. It would be akin to saying God abandoned his people in their minds. So they immediately come to him. They're sitting on the Mount of Olives. They privately saying, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Some of your translations may say differently. It may say end of the world. This is a bad translation. The word is age. It refers to a time period. It's eon. So King James and others, they missed the mark on that. And it does add to some of the problem that many have in this understanding. Okay, but this is the end of the age. They're looking around them, and they are thinking in their minds, like, this is a huge deal, what Jesus just said. They have no idea how this could be real, but they believe Jesus, and they want some understanding. So, Jesus here is going to give a number of teachings, which Matthew compiles into one, to explain to the disciples what's going to happen, when it's going to happen. And I want you to note that this is not just going to be theoretical knowledge for these people. This is going to be practical knowledge for many of the people, because they will be alive when this takes place. So let's get into looking at some of the things that were said. All right, so they want to know, what in the world, Jesus? You're saying some big things here. What's going to happen? Someone read verses 4 and 5 for us. Grab it. Let's move quick. Who we got?
Jesus answered, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many.
Okay, so Jesus says, they want to know, when's this going to take place? And Jesus tells them, okay, here's some things to be watching for. First of all, know many are going to arise as false messiahs. Before this destruction comes, you're going to see all types of people coming up saying, I'm the Messiah. Now, I don't know what's the best way to teach this. Should I go ahead and start telling what goes on historically at this time period around the destruction, or do we just leave it? I don't know. There's part of me that says, well, we'll just get to the end and kind of summarize it all. But just as we run through, I'll tell you that before Jerusalem was destroyed, there was a big gathering that did take place because the Romans had finally had it with Jerusalem for some rebellions that were taking place, and many Jews started fleeing to Jerusalem. It was a walled city, so from all of the surrounding areas, as the Romans were approaching, they started running to it. And there were many that arose at that time saying, I'm the Messiah, we're going to have a great victory over the Romans today. It's coming. We're about to lead into a great victory over the Romans. So there were many that were literally claiming to be false messiahs, or claiming to be messiahs at this point that were false. Jesus said this would happen. Let's continue reading verses 6 through 8.
You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains.
All right, so he says you're going to hear about things happening, different parts of the world, different places, earthquakes, whatever you want to put in the blank there. He says, don't worry about it. That's just the beginning. The Romans are not about to fall, is really what, there were many thinking that the Romans were about to be toppled by God. And that was going to come in many different ways, according to the false messiahs that you might be listening to. But as they looked around, they looked for validating evidence that this was happening. So if you're here in Jerusalem and you're saying, oh yeah, we're about to have a great victory over the Romans, well, what's the sign that that's going to happen? Well, in another part of the empire, did you hear about that big earthquake? The Romans are being weakened. You hear there's about to be a war break out on this frontier? The Romans are about to be weakened. God's about to bring their whole house down. Jesus says, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. Let's continue reading. Verses 9 and 10.
Then they will hand you over to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. And at that time many will fall away, and they will betray one another and hate one another.
You know, if you want to see what he's actually talking about, you could read the book of Hebrews. Hebrew letter was written to Jewish Christians that were struggling, and some were falling away. And there's an interesting statement. I'll kick another little thing while we're out here. There's an interesting statement about how the Christians should be assembling, and they should not forsake the assembling of themselves together. And they should be doing it all the more as they see the day approaching. And I want to suggest to you the day in that context is the same day Jesus is talking about. Pressure was rising, persecution was rising. They were handing Christians over to kill them. The Jewish persecution was real. And they were going after Christians in many places. And there were brethren falling away because of it. And Paul says, or whoever is writing Hebrews, likely Paul, but we don't know for sure. But the author of Hebrews says, hey, as you see this day approaching, don't stop assembling. Assemble all the more. We need each other. We need our community because the day is approaching. Okay, let's then see what else. Verse 11. Someone read that for us.
Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many.
Okay, false prophets are coming. They're coming to lead the people away. That certainly is something that was happening around Jerusalem at this time period. People saying, I received a message from God. We're going to win a great victory here. Jesus says it's to be expected. Says, we're going to move a little quickly through his. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Now, some look at that and say, well, that hadn't happened yet. According to their thinking at this time period, they did. In fact, in the book of Colossians, Paul specifically said the gospel has been preached in the whole world. They had a very fast ramp up to spreading the gospel in this generation between when Jesus speaks and when Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD. And yeah, it's some summary type of language. But from their perspective, the gospel was being preached in the whole world. The gospel was fast-tracked. And we might also note, as an interesting tie-in, what actually, in human terms, kicked the Christians out of Jerusalem and started spreading the gospel everywhere. Does anybody remember in the book of Acts? What happened? Because the church was growing tremendously in Jerusalem. That's right. Stephen was stoned in Acts chapter 7, and the persecution began against the Christians. And so the Christians fled, but they went everywhere preaching the word. That's what kicks off this whole thing. And then guess what? You have this man who was leading a persecution now to go get them in other places and bring them back for trial, who sees Jesus on the road. Who's that man? Saul, who became the Apostle Paul. And he becomes the apostle to the Gentiles and starts championing the spreading of the gospel everywhere. I don't think this is coincidental. This is all connected. Jesus described the process right here in Matthew 24 of what would take place. Okay, we continue reading. Verse 15, someone pick it for us.
So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath.
Let's pause there for a minute. This abomination of desolation, man, we can't get into it right now, but we are going to get more into it next week. In the book of Daniel, there was a prophesied time period coming. And Jesus is telling us the interpretation right here. There would be a time when the temple would be desolated. I want to suggest to you that that literally happened at the destruction of Jerusalem. There was a man, and we're going to be talking more about this man. There was a man who was a great leader among the Roman army that brought a pig into the temple and sacrificed it on the altar before the temple was destroyed. It wasn't enough to destroy the people. He wanted to defile their place of worship, the center of their worship. And the Jews, of course, don't eat pigs. They're unclean animals. So he brought a pig in and he killed it on the altar because he wanted to shame them as much as he possibly could. The hate was deep. Does anybody happen to know who that man was? Titus. Titus was the commanding general that destroyed the city of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. You can go right now to Rome and you can see the Arch of Titus, and it commemorates the destruction of Jerusalem. And you can walk around it and see the 7-candle holder being carried out of the temple. It's engraved right now in Rome. You can go look at a whole bunch of images carrying away the treasure of the temple and all that was there. This is what Jesus was talking about. The abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel. In other words, this isn't only something Jesus is speaking about. He says this has been being prophesied for centuries. This is an old prophecy. There was a time coming when God's wrath would be poured out on this country. Now, you'll note that Daniel, he was in exile, right? And he was given a prophecy of when the people would return to the land and all the things that would happen there. But he also was given prophecies about another destruction that would come in the future. And it would be a worse destruction. And Jesus says, this is what was spoken. Let the reader understand. Matthew added that. He's telling you, go study this. Let the reader understand. This is what Daniel spoke about as well. Okay, we're continuing on. So we have the false prophets, we've got the gospel spreading, we've got abomination taking place, and then the message given to Christians, which you started reading into a moment ago for us. Let's go ahead and drop down through verse 20 where it says, pray that your flight will not be in winter or on a Sabbath. So in other words, Christians, they're being given a special message by Jesus right here. When you see these things starting, when you see them going, what does Jesus say the Christians should do? Right. Now, should you take your time, pack your bags, make sure you got everything you need? No. Jesus says, don't go back into your house. Wherever you're at, when you see it coming, flee. Get out of there. That is not something that he meant to be misunderstood. This is not a message Jesus was giving in a way that no one can understand. Jesus is giving a message that he's very serious about, and he expects his listeners to take seriously. Don't go back into your house. Get out of there. Run when you see these things happening. Okay. Then we get into some things that are hard for us as modern readers to understand, but I'm going to make a few cross references for you that I hope will bring it into quick grasping if you haven't looked at this before already. So if we continue on verse 21, someone read it for us. Okay.
For then there will be a great tribulation such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will.
All right, very bad suffering obviously is coming, a tribulation. That sounds familiar. We have whole things today talk about the tribulation that is to come. Jesus says a great tribulation is coming. But he didn't put it thousands of years away. Jesus was telling them practical application. He started earlier there in chapter 23, before this generation passes, and he's coming to it when we get back to verses 34 and 36 in this chapter. Jesus is not talking about something for thousands of years later. He's talking about something many of them around him are going to live to see. Keep your eyes open, he says. There is going to be something bad. We're going to talk about how bad it became here in just a little while, but we'll just keep moving for now. So let's look at some of this apocalyptic language. 22, we're not going to read all of this, but 22 through 30 is full of apocalyptic language. It says that the days, unless they've been cut short, no one would have been saved. So we have shortened days in verse 22. He talks about the false prophets and messiahs again. He says, I told you in advance. But when we get down to verse 27, just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. So Jesus is going to come. Wherever the corpse is, the vultures will gather. Bad translation, that's eagles right there. Much better to understand it as eagles. Does anybody know what the Roman seal was? They're going to be marching in with banners, eagles, all over. You can look to parallel accounts. We're going to do this in a little while and see more of this. We continue going in the text, and he talks about after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, the Son of Man will appear in the sky, the tribes of the earth will mourn, they will see the sun coming in the clouds. This all really sounds like the end of the world stuff. I will completely agree that that's what it sounds like. Let's look to some other texts as well. Hold your hand here. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 13. Isaiah 13, someone read verse 10 when you get there. Someone else go, if you will, to the book of Ezekiel, chapter 32. So we got two texts, Isaiah 13, Ezekiel 32. And I would like for verse 8 to be read in Ezekiel 32. In Isaiah 13, someone read verse 10 for us, please.
For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light.
You can read around this as well and see a lot of similar language to that. If you want to know what he's talking about, because that sounds like the end of the world, doesn't it? But if you go back to verse 1, we see this, give this prophecy against the king of Babylon. The Jews used language like this to describe the fall of nations because it's like the world ending. It's like if the stars fell from the sky. It's like if the moon turned to blood. It's like if the sun didn't give light anymore. When you have such a reality in your mind that this is what reality is, and this ends, it's like the world has ended. And so they describe it in ways that the world would look like if it ended. And I know that's very foreign of a concept to us, but it was very common to them. It's throughout the Old Testament. One other example, although there are many of this, Ezekiel 32, someone read verse 8.
All the shining lights in the heavens I will darken over you. I will set darkness on your land, declares the Lord God.
If you continue to read around this text, you have more of that apocalyptic language as well. And that, if you look back to the beginning of the chapter on that, was a prophecy that was to be given to the Pharaoh of Egypt. Again, physical nations would fall. What Jesus was saying here is no different than language we see throughout the Old Testament. It's no different than the language that we see in the book of Revelation as well, which most of that, again, it was 17 times in Revelation was said, these things will soon be upon you, it will soon come to pass. This was not something that they should be thinking is thousands of years away. He said they were being killed. And the message was to comfort them. These were people really being persecuted. And Jesus gave them a message of comfort and then told them it's soon to come to pass. It was the fall of a nation that was being described there as well. Again, I know this is not something that we do today, but we're not Jews. We're not Easterners. We are Westerners, and we think and we communicate like Westerners 2,000 years later. They thought and communicated like Easterners 2,000 years ago. And I will also note that Easterners often still communicate more akin to this than we do today. You can look to Eastern religion, you can look to Eastern writings and see the same type of poetic language being used today. They are more poetic in how they describe things than we are. And that is hard for us. It is. But just because it's hard for us doesn't mean that we should then be westernizing, over-logicking the message that was given back in this day. So even if this is hard for you to accept right now, that's okay. Go and think about it some more. I encourage you to do some more study on it. We can have some more conversation. I'm happy to do that. But for right now, I would like you just to consider that Jesus wasn't being literal when he said these things. He was describing the fall of a nation, the Jewish nation at that. And it was a really big deal. And the people, for them, hearing that the temple is going to be destroyed and that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, it is like the sun losing its light. It is like the moon being blood. To them, that's what it was like. And Jesus coming in the clouds, we don't have time to run into all of this right now, but God came in the clouds over and over and over again in the Old Testament. And it was judgment against nations. He would come in the clouds and destroy them. It's picturing God coming like a tremendous storm, which in their agricultural society is what they experience life through. They see a mighty, terrifying, lightning-filled storm coming, and Jesus is in it. This is no accident or happenstance of nature. This is judgment, and it will soon be upon them. That's where we come into our primary text. After all of these things were said, look to 32. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Let's pause there for a moment. The destruction that we just read, we have to figure out a way to understand it. Because Jesus said it's all coming in their generation. This generation will not pass away until all of these things are fulfilled. So how are we Westerners supposed to understand that? Well, that's what we're looking to the Old Testament for. And we're seeing how apocalyptic language is used. Because it didn't seem to pass away. I mean, it didn't seem like all those things took place, right? Well, if you're being a literal Westerner, it doesn't. But if you're being an Easterner, it very well did happen. It happened just as Jesus described. Jesus didn't lie. He didn't make a mistake. He said exactly what he intended to say. We'll come back to that. I want to press into this a little bit more because I want to deal with even harder language. Why not? We're here. We're in the deep end. Let's drop down a little bit farther and let's read some other things that would be taking place. In verses, I want to read the whole text. We can't do this, so we're going to just, let's see. Verse 31, he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet. They will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to another. I actually think this is the hardest statement in the entire text, but that doesn't mean that I don't think there's an understanding of it. There was this unique time period that was taking place between the death of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem, in which the gospel is spreading. And we have hard questions that we might come with from that. It's like, well, at what point are people accountable to the gospel and not the old covenant? Because the whole world's being called to repentance through the gospel, right? The whole world is. But the gospel hadn't spread to the whole world. In fact, for something like 6 years, the gospel was only being preached in Jerusalem after Jesus' death. So when we think about that, what in the world is going on in that time period? I mean, we end up seeing Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, right? He was a God-fearer among the Jews, which means he was an uncircumcised individual but believed in the God of Israel and so would try to do some good and things of that nature. So he is someone who apparently had found great favor in God's sight, but he wasn't a Christian until he heard the gospel and obeyed the gospel. Now, I don't want to get way far off into conjecture, but I want to suggest that what Jesus is actually saying here can very easily connect to some of those ideas. And I tie it personally to Hebrews chapter 12. Someone turn to Hebrews 12 very quickly and read verses 22 through 24 for us, please. Hebrews 12, 22 through 24. Someone pick that up. Who's got it?
I've got it.
All right, thanks, Derek.
But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect. Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood which speaks better than the blood of Abel.
What I am suggesting is that taking off some of the figurative wrapping of what Jesus is saying here in verse 31, I want to suggest to you that this was the gospel going out, being preached, and bringing people into one body spiritually. When he says that the elect would be gathered from the ends of the earth and brought toward him, I think that he's talking spiritually speaking of what Hebrews 12 is saying. This is where you're all coming to. It's the spiritual Mount Zion, where the physical Mount Zion is about to be under tremendous siege and Jerusalem will be destroyed. We are being gathered together to a spiritual Mount Zion. We are all before Christ. We're before the throne. So the physical covenant is being destroyed. The physical representation of the covenant is being destroyed. The lineages are being destroyed. All of those things are vanishing. And Jesus is bringing us all into one and bringing us all to one spiritual place. As the gospel was going forward, was being preached everywhere during this whole transitional covenant time period, he's gathering us together into something new. From the four winds of the earth, we would be gathered by the Son of Man from one end of the sky to the other. Because then he goes to say in verse 34 again, all these things will take place before this generation ends. There is a timestamp that Jesus puts on this. And the only way to get around that is to get rid of the timestamp. And this is what many have done with this text. If you look to modern interpretation of Matthew 24, wherein we're talking about Jesus is going to come and do these things maybe in our age or maybe in some future age, what they depend on is getting rid of the statement that it's all coming in this generation. And there are literally commentators that say Jesus changed his mind. I mean, you laugh, and I'm not trying to mock anybody on this. This is seriously the key to interpretation for many people in this text, is that Jesus changed his mind, or because of the Jews' rejection, Jesus decided not to do this right now. Either way, Jesus changed his mind, okay? And that is the cornerstone that a different interpretation of Matthew 24 must rest upon. So when you are looking at some of the things that I'm saying, and if there's any difficulty there of like the apocalyptic language or Jesus gathering together from the four winds, if you're having difficulty with that, it's understandable because it's difficult language. But we have a timeline that Jesus gives, and we have to have an interpretation that fits into that timeline, because I reject the proposal that Jesus changed his mind. And I don't just reject it because I couldn't handle that. If Jesus changed his mind, then fine. But I want to suggest to you that nothing changed about the circumstance that would have caused Jesus to change his mind. This whole thing was not based upon whether the Jews would receive his word. It was based upon their rejection of his word, which is what he talked about in Matthew chapter 23, which is what John is talking about in John chapter 1 when he comes in and says that Jesus came to his own and his own did not receive him. These prophecies were not made hoping that the people would come to Jesus before it happened. They were made because they were not coming to Jesus. And judgment was coming for that. So what changed that would have made Jesus change his mind? It's not the same as Abraham appealing to God and saying, well, if you find 100 faithful, would you spare the city? Or if you found 10 faithful. None of that took place. The condition was exactly set as Jesus described it when you came to 70 AD. And this monumental event actually took place. Many want to explain it away because they don't want to deal with the apocalyptic language. I'm saying the apocalyptic language is the key to properly understanding it, not explaining it away. Paul certainly continues to see the Jews as being rebellious toward the Messiah. We're not going to go there for now, but if you were to read Romans chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, you see Paul's description of the Jewish nation as a whole continuing to reject what was being taught. And he says, I was one of them, but now he's a follower of Christ. Using a common phrase of time, Jesus says this in verse 35. He says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. This is a common phrase. It was in common usage during Jesus' day. Jesus uses a very similar phrase in Matthew 5, 17 through 18. He says, do not think I came to abolish the law of the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Saying, heaven and earth will pass away, but these words won't pass away, was a common phrase to say this is that sure. These words are more solid than the existence of heaven and earth are. Trust it. So Jesus doubles down. Isn't that relevant? That Jesus said, this generation, all these things will happen. And then he doubles down and says, these words are so sure, they're more sure than the existence of heaven and earth. Heaven and earth will pass away. These words will not. They are solid. Jesus doesn't leave room for, I might change my mind about this. Jesus is all in. This is what's coming. We affirm a promise. We should uphold the word of Jesus. This generation, though, is the most specific that the Lord could be. I want you to note how he says big to small. All right? So go back to our tough text here. He says, heaven and earth, they'll happen. 34, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So he tells us, this generation. Well, what day? They want to know what day and hour, Lord. And he says, but of that day and hour, no one knows. Not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. I can tell you it's coming in this generation, but I can't tell you what day or hour it's coming. I can only tell you the signs to look for. So he's preparing them to be able to recognize as that day and hour approaches, because he can't tell them exactly when. But it's coming this generation. It'd be the same if you were talking to me and say, you know what? I'm going to die. And the next century, I'm going to pass away. I can't tell you the day or hour, but I have some signs that you could probably look for. Might see a failing body. I mean, it could happen in an accident. I'm no prophet. But you might see signs of my failing body. You might see struggles, repeated struggles with my health, and they get more and more frequent as time goes. I could give you signs that you generally would be able to look for, and I'm no prophet. Jesus is speaking prophetic truths. Here are things that will happen. So watch for those and know it's coming within this time frame of the next generation. And he gives some final warnings as you get nearer to the end of the chapter here. He repeatedly doubles down on this. Verse 42, he says, therefore be on alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. You notice how he emphasizes the day again. You don't know the day this is going to happen. He's not changing conversation. This is another thing I've seen in the church a lot. I grew up hearing this actually, that, well, all that stuff up to our tough text was all about the destruction of Jerusalem, but the stuff that comes after is about the end of time. I don't see that. I see Jesus doubling down on the same language, coming back to the same principles over and over again. And I will add, we don't have time to do this, but if you juxtapose, that is, you take all the puzzle pieces from Luke's accounts in chapter 17 and 21, as well as Mark 13, and you were to lay those out like puzzle pieces, and then you compare them to Matthew 24, they're all rearranged. So stuff that comes later, comes earlier, and so you can't have this divide where Jesus suddenly changes topic. That also would go against the way Matthew groups the book. Matthew groups his book around core teachings around the same topic. So when you come into Matthew 23, you're dealing with the rebellion of the Jews. In chapter 24, you're dealing with the final judgment of the Jews that is coming in the destruction of Jerusalem. When you get into chapter 25, you're dealing with the spiritual judgment of those same people. This is why I think many brethren have taken and tried to say there's a shift to then talk about the end of the world, because you see a spiritual judgment of the Jews in chapter 25. But that's not the point. The point is these same individuals rebelled, were physically judged, were spiritually judged. We don't have to change to an end-of-the-world scenario to be able to accommodate Matthew's building of this case. All right. So again, I want to reference this one piece. Luke's account of this information gives more details that the disciples were to look for. He includes some other pieces. We're running out of time, but I really want to go to this. In Luke chapter 17 and verse 37, if you just open your Bibles there and look for just a moment, I want you to note that he says that this will happen where the eagles gather. That is the same word as the vultures that was there in Matthew 24. He also specifically describes in chapter 21, Luke 21:20, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that her desolation is near. Does anybody remember the path Jesus told his disciples to flee? He says, when you see these things, you come off your rooftop, where should they go? Flee to the mountains. Jesus in Matthew 24 didn't just tell them to get out of town. He told them the path to take out of town. Flee to the mountains. Do you know what happened? Do you know how hard it is for a mountain pass to be closed by a standing army? Even today. When the U.S. is in war in the mountains, you know how hard it is to find people? It was the same way back then, and even more so. So I want to very quickly just go through what actually happened. Let's talk about the fulfillment of this. In 70 A.D., the city of Jerusalem was surrounded and cut off by the Roman army. Some reports claim that over 2 million Jews were killed in the impending siege and destruction. It was such a brutal scene. And you would think, man, the Christians were caught up in that. And according to the authors of the time period, we don't know of a single Christian that was killed. Not a single Christian was killed in this whole siege. Josephus records for us that the Christians fled. And guess the path that they fled through? The mountains. It was the last that the Roman army could close. When they came marching in to surround the city, it took them the longest to close the mountain passes. And that's the path the Christians were fleeing to. When they saw the banners, when they saw the Roman army coming, there were false prophets, false messiahs saying, everybody come to Jerusalem. We're going to have a great victory. Josephus even says there were signs and wonders that happened. One thing that he records was during a great feast, while the city is under siege, there was a great feast in the temple court. All these people were there, and it says this mighty image appeared above them all of a warrior standing. And it reinforced the heart of the people that they could win a great victory. Signs and wonders taking place. False messiahs, false prophets, and the Christians got out. They were out of there. And millions were killed, brutally butchered. Not before they were eating their own children from starvation, though. A tribulation such as the world had never seen. Then, when they broke through the city gates and the Romans flooded in, killing everyone that they could find, carrying those that were outside of the city, by the way. This is another thing we didn't get into here. At the end of Matthew 24, it talks about how one will be taken and another will be left. When they were coming in to surround the city, they were grabbing people and carrying them off into captivity to be placed in different parts of the empire. They were done with the Jews. They were no longer going to have their own land. They were no longer going to be able to be there as a people. They were going to interbreed with everyone else. They were going to lose it all. So when they broke into the city after this and they were just killing everyone that was in there, that's when Titus brought the pig in and sacrificed it on the altar, the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel. And then They burned the temple. And you think, well, the temple is stone. How'd they do that? They kept piling up material to burn the temple so hot that it melted gold, and it got down into the crevices around the stones. And the Romans were then later so obsessed with getting every bit of gold they could out of the place, they literally dug up every single stone of the temple so that they could get the gold that had melted between the cracks. When Jesus said not one stone will be left, not one stone was left. When the Romans finally pulled out of Jerusalem, the temple was gone. The genealogies were gone. The people were gone. It was exactly as Jesus spoke, and the Christians were gone long before those things took place. History doesn't tell us that Jesus waited, that he changed his mind. History tells us that Jesus is true to his word. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. He came in the clouds. Matthew 24, 34 through 36 put the entire chapter into a timeline that gives us, as Bible students nearly 2,000 years later, the ability to analyze the text, place it into a historical context, and harmonize it with all of the difficulties of interpretation that we have. And if you come back next week, we're going even deeper. All right, thank you very much for your attention. We are out of time, over on time. Appreciate your patience. See you next week.